Hello, and welcome to episode 8 of the Dark Money Files, in which we shine a light into a murky world. I'm Ray Blake, and with me is my co-host, friend and business partner, Graham Barrow. Hello, Graham.
Hi, Ray.
And what have we got in store for our listeners this week, Graham?
Ray, given the impact of the Troika laundromat, the report this week that Swedbank have apparently discovered rather more in the way of suspicious funds than hitherto believed.
Well, that's a surprise.
Yeah. Anyway, I thought we should look at some of the events identified in the B&H report into Danske Bank Estonia, which provided an opportunity to expose the suspicious activity at a much earlier stage, and yet nothing much happened.
Which is why you asked me to read specifically Chapter 9.3 of the B&H report.
It is, and for a sub-chapter with the rather dry heading of Operation, it makes for pretty interesting reading, doesn't it?
It certainly does.
So, what were the main things that grabbed your attention, Ray?
Well, there's quite a few actually, Graham. Let's go through each of the main points and then look at some in a bit more detail.
Away you go.
Okay, first item. In 2008, they decided not to migrate the Baltic branches onto their main IT platform, which, had they done so, would have given them access to business and risk data, but the plan was abandoned as it was too expensive.
We've mentioned this before, but 2008 was the point at which the credit crunch was really starting to bite, and banks, Danske included, were under significant financial pressure.
Yes, although the counter-argument might have been that connecting the entire network would have helped them run the bank more efficiently, and therefore save money in that way. It's also worth noting that the cancellation of the IT migration included a call for additional initiatives in the area of compliance.
By which I guess they mean introduce additional controls to counter the lack of an integrated platform.
Yeah, you'd think so. The situation probably wasn't helped by the group internal audit reports from 2008 and 09, which were pretty favourable, giving the branch the second best rating out of 5, while the Estonian audits were predominantly green.
This at a time where there were flows of around 20 billion euros annually through the non-resident portfolio?
Yes, that's right. This was followed up by an inspection by the Estonian FSA, who provided a final inspection report written in Estonian, which was given to Group Compliance and AML in Denmark, along with an English summary.
I would hope the group wouldn't have relied on the English summary and had the overall report translated. Do we know if they did?
No, we don't. Even so, the summary had a few points of note in it.
Oh, go on.
Well, it said that while the attitude of branch staff had improved considerably and that the branch had changed its internal procedures in line with legal amendments made in 2008, which I think must refer to the implementation of the European Union's third anti-money laundering directive, which we've talked about before. And it said that the branch had changed its procedures, albeit, quotes, with some deficiencies, quotes. And they also wrote, and this is a long quote, "The documents and information about customers and their activities reviewed in the course of the on-site inspection did not comply with the requirements of legislation and or the internal procedures of the branch in all cases." And they stressed the importance of, quotes, "obtaining the relevant information, especially about the beneficial owners, ownership and control structures, and economic activities of customers, in order to guarantee that the branch and the entire financial system of Estonia function in a manner that is trustworthy and in compliance with international standards," unquote.
Wow. I mean, that's pretty unequivocal, isn't it? I mean, we've worked in a number of banks, Ray, and if any bank we were working in received that comment from a regulator, I think it would require pretty instant action.
It would. To be fair, this was 10 years ago, before most of the big money laundering stories had broken, but nevertheless, it's a fairly straightforward comment. The regulator have basically told Danske Bank that they were not meeting their legal requirements in all cases, and that not only were they breaking the law, they were actually putting the financial system of a country at risk.
Yes. Is there any evidence that they did something about it?
Not in the report, although you'd have to say there's a fair bit of evidence that they didn't, judging by subsequent events.
Well, that's true.
But that's not the end of it by a long way.
Really?
Oh yeah, the next heading is News Reports in 2010.
Oh, so this will be public domain stuff.
Oh yes.
Oh, interesting.
All the more so as it has echoes of one of our previous episodes.
Oh.
Yeah, the report's a bit vague at this point, but it points to a newspaper report in 2010 linking a specific company to the Estonian branch and a North Korean arms smuggling case in Thailand.
Blimey. Did you manage to find the newspaper report?
Yep. It goes into quite a bit of detail, but doesn't actually name Danske Bank in Estonia. It does, however, name a lady called Stella Port-Louis, who achieved some notoriety when she was singled out by former US President Obama back in 2007, when even then she was director to more than 100 companies registered in Wyoming.
Oh, and do we know where Ms. Port-Louis comes from?
The Seychelles, Graham.
Well, of course she does.
2010 wasn't a good year for her, as she was a director of 4 companies involved in the Wachovia case, where the bank was used as a conduit by the Sinaloa cartel to move huge amounts of money through the system.
Oh, now I remember that case. Now, Wachovia was fined for failing to apply proper AML rules to around $378 billion of wire transfers.
Yeah, and that's nearly double the Danske Bank flows, but it's now been rather forgotten.
It has. Okay, any others?
Well, yeah, there's the Magnitsky money. She was a director of a company that moved part of those funds around the world.
Okay, so she's a director of a company that's helped North Korea evade sanctions, several companies that enabled a Mexican drug cartel to launder funds into the US,
Yep.
and another company that's part of the Magnitsky affair.
Yeah, she's doing well. Although the report states that although the journalist who published the story approached the branch in Estonia, there was no evidence that Group was informed at the time.
But there were other newspapers who did make the connection, weren't there?
Yes, there were. Do you want to pick up the story from here?
Yeah, why don't I? So, 7 days after that original report was published, which didn't mention Danske Bank specifically, a further report was carried in a New Zealand news website, which does specifically state that the company in question held an account at Danske Bank in Estonia.
In 2010?
Yes. I mean, Ray, the story is almost a geography lesson. It alleges, based on legal documentation, that North Korean arms were bound for Iran on a Georgian-registered cargo plane, which was seized by Thai authorities on the 12th of December 2009. Now, allegedly, its next stop was Sri Lanka, of course. The plane was owned by our New Zealand company, which had a Chinese director. It had originally departed from Kiev in Ukraine, with a final destination of Gostomel in Georgia.
Crikey.
Ray, we're not finished yet. The New Zealand company had signed a deal with a company based in Kiev, which then signed a deal with a company in Hong Kong to charter the plane. And finally, the report says that the New Zealand company held an account with Danske Bank in Estonia, with payments being routed by their correspondent bank, the Deutsche Bank Trust Company of New York.
So, I lost count, Graham. How many countries were involved altogether?
12.
12.
Now, here's where I think there are lessons to be learned.
I agree. We already know that Danske Estonia held accounts on behalf of a large number of New Zealand companies, and providing they'd done any sort of reasonable know your customer, they'd know that there were clear and direct connections between virtually all of them.
Providing, Ray, providing.
But I mean, it's pretty basic stuff, Graham. Unless that warning by the Estonian FSA extended to basic information like the registered address of the company being onboarded. They really should have known.
Yeah, no, I agree. And that brings me to one of my constant refrains. We need to become more proactive in managing AML risk.
Yeah, I agree.
Ray, can I give you a real life example of what I mean by that?
Oh, please do, Graham.
Okay, well, it's a matter of public record that for a while I was the interim head of the Cooperative Bank's High Risk and Complex Case Investigations Unit. So shortly after I joined, a case emerged which strongly suggested criminality, and it was probably a boiler room.
Now this is a criminal enterprise set up to defraud people, isn't it, Graham? Generally through phone contact that implies investment opportunities or tax penalties that tricks people into parting with their money and then sort of disappears without a trace.
Yeah, that's absolutely right, Ray.
So actually finding one in operation before it disappears is a big deal.
Yes, it is. And it seemed unlikely to me that we just happened to catch the only one who have set up a corporate account with the co-op to use in this way. So I asked for a printout of all the new corporate accounts opened within a 6-week window either side of the one we identified, because I just thought if they're going to open them, they're going to open them in a block. Now, I'm not going to say exactly what they were, but there were clear indicators which identified the account, and we found the same indicators in 7 or 8 other accounts that were either opened or attempted to be opened at around the same time.
Attempted, Graham? That suggests that some got through and others didn't.
Exactly, which straight away gave us the opportunity to understand what was working and what wasn't. In the end, it turned out to be the vigilance of some excellent onboarding colleagues who noticed unlikely similarities in different account opening requests that led them to reject some of them. But I think in the end 6 got through, although fortunately only the one we caught actually received and transmitted money.
Well, thank goodness.
Yeah. I think the other good thing was that when we filed the suspicious activity report, we were able to call out the commonalities between the accounts, which I suspect would help narrow down who the culprits were. The one I remember most was that they all opened the accounts using bank statements from the same branch of the same bank, all of which were real accounts, but which had been closed within the last 18 months, and fake names had been added to the real account details.
Anything else relevant you did at the co-op?
Yeah, we did what I'd like to call proactive transaction monitoring.
Now, what does that mean, Graham?
Well, transaction monitoring is usually reactive. You find a random stretch of road and sit beside it watching all the traffic going past, and if you see something odd, you pull it over and have a good look. Proactive transaction monitoring is where instead you go and target specific traffic black spots or use intelligence to target your observation. So if, for instance, you knew that red cars were the most likely both to speed and to be involved in crashes, you might go and talk to everyone who's bought a red car this week.
How does that translate into transaction monitoring? What did you do?
Well, I just asked for a list of the 200 accounts with the highest total credits over the last 12 months. It was an extraordinarily productive exercise.
I can imagine. And of course, you might easily have asked over different time periods, the last week, the last month, 3 months. And oddly, each of those might catch quite different typologies.
We need to be careful here, Ray. We're giving this stuff away for nothing, where others might charge a fortune for it.
Well, it's one thing knowing, Graham. It's another thing doing it properly.
That's true. Shall we move on?
Back to the report. I should point out that action was taken within the Estonian branch with respect to the North Korean story, which B&H could not share for legal reasons.
Oh, I wonder if that means they filed a SAR.
Entirely possible. And it turns out that within days of the North Korean report, there was another one, this time in the Estonian press, linking the branch to a specific customer involved in a money laundering scheme through a currency exchange operator. This story was also picked up by the Danish press a few days later and caused questions to be asked at group level and again at executive board level a month or so later, following questions asked by one of Danske's correspondent banks.
Ooh, do we know which one?
No. And once again, the report says that action was taken within the Estonian branch, which the report couldn't share.
Another SAR.
Probably.
And sadly, partly because I suspect there were no English language versions of this report, And partly because of the avalanche of recent reporting around Danske Bank, I've been unable to find that original story. But if any of our listeners can provide a link, or indeed if they want to send us any messages or feedback or comments or suggestions for future podcasts, they can message us on Twitter using hashtag TDMF, or include our profile name at dark_files in a tweet, or they can direct message us, as our messages on Twitter are set to open, which means anyone can message us.
Yeah, or if they prefer, they can email us at thedarkmoneyfiles@gmail.com.
Okay, good. So back to the story. So we've now discovered that the report makes clear that back in 2010, within days of each other, 2 reports were circulating in the press, both linked to money laundering or sanctions evasion, and both alleging a connection to Danske in Estonia.
Yes, and as far as I can see, nothing much happened, except that at exactly the same time these reports were circulating in January 2010, an executive board meeting discussed, albeit briefly, the Estonian branch and the non-resident portfolio.
Oh, what did it say?
There was a discussion on focus areas and profitability, but the discussion is not reflected in the minutes.
Really? Is it just me, or would you expect an executive board meeting to be fully and carefully minuted?
I would, Graham. We only know this because an email the following month between other employees at group level stated that a member of the executive board had pointed to a slow expansion of Estonia, although making it clear it shouldn't be at the expense of anti-money laundering efforts.
What anti-money laundering efforts?
Yeah, no comment. On the other hand, we also know from the B&H report that the flow in Estonia increased year on year from 2009 until 2013. So circumstantially, that slow expansion of Estonia is exactly what came through.
Anything else?
Well, the executive board met again in March 2010, and on the agenda was the number of SARs filed by the Estonian branch.
Oh, that suggests at least someone was taking the problem seriously even then.
Well, yes. Mind you, the report says that Danske Estonia accounts for 30% of all Estonian SARs, but this was attributed to the high standards of Danske Bank compared to other banks in Estonia.
Which means one of 2 things, I think, right? Either they're right and there is far worse to come from other banks in Estonia, or they're wrong and their response was wholly inadequate.
Well, there is a third possibility, Graham, which is that they were at least partly right, but their response was still inadequate. I wouldn't rule that out. At the same time, the minutes also state that there was some concern over the many Russian transfers, but the Russian Central Bank had said they were okay with them, and they hadn't come across anything that gave cause for concern.
Okay, and anyone who's listened to episode 3 will realise just how unlikely that is. You do wonder where they were looking.
Yeah, absolutely. And without meaning to be rude, I'm not entirely sure that banks should rely on the Russian Central Bank as the source of any reassurance.
Fair play. Anything else in 2010?
Yes, at the Executive Board meeting in September, there was again reporting on the number of SARs, which was again met with the response that the Estonian branch was comfortable with the substantial Russian deposits, and also that the Russian Central Bank had approved the establishment of a representative office in Moscow.
But, hold on, Ray, if you've got a branch that is filing a disproportionate number of SARs and has high levels of Russian deposits, is it not possible, just kind of knowing the way things operate in Russia, that of course the Russian Central Bank would approve a representative office?
Well, quite. And while the report doesn't say so directly, if you're Danske Bank and you've got one branch, Estonia, which is filing a disproportionate number of SARs, surely it can mean that either you've got a problem with the Estonia branch or you've got a problem with all your other branches that aren't filing enough.
Yes, and all this against the background of the Baltic branches not being on their integrated IT platform, so there is no real ability to access this information remotely. I mean, you are relying on local branch reporting.
And given that 42 people have been referred to the Estonian Financial Intelligence Unit and 10 have subsequently been arrested, it calls into question that strategy, doesn't it?
Yes.
Graham, I'm conscious that we've talked about 3 different and distinct types of criminality today. As well as our usual topic of money laundering, we've talked about fraud too, and sanctions evasion. Is it worth spelling out the key differences?
Oh, I think that's a good idea, Ray. Do you want to start?
Happy to. Money laundering is the process of introducing the proceeds of crime into the banking system, concealing its origins and disguising its nature so as to give it the appearance of legitimate money that the criminals can then spend or invest as they wish.
Yes, and money laundering therefore is always a secondary crime because for it to be necessary there has to be what we would call a predicate crime through which the money was derived in the first place.
That's right, Graham. It might be fraud, like your boiler rooms, or tax evasion, or bribery or corruption, or just common or garden theft.
Indeed, sanctions evasion is also criminal, but it's a crime in and of itself. Sanctions are imposed by governments and by international organisations like the UN. Some just apply locally, but many have worldwide application. For instance, it's illegal to supply military goods to North Korea wherever you are in the world, other than in North Korea.
Yeah, that's right. And if you're a bank, you're breaking the law if you allow your products and services to be used to allow that to happen.
So the banks are responsible for what their clients do in this regard.
Well, yes, to an extent. Your client may be a firm that would love to trade with Iran, for instance, that has done so in the past and that has found it highly profitable to do so. Now there are US sanctions in place, which means that the client can't sell to customers in Iran anymore.
But the Iranian customers might still need those goods.
Yes, they might. And there are firms that will break the law and supply them, particularly if the survival of their own business might be at stake.
Yes, and that might lead them to do other things like trying to disguise what they're doing, what they are actually supplying, or who and where the customer is based. And of course, bear in mind that sanctions can apply to individuals, to an organisation and to an entire country. And they're not just financial, but the financial ones are the ones that we're particularly interested in.
Okay, so that complexity and the opportunities for concealment means that it's not easy for the banks to catch this sort of thing sometimes.
It's not easy, no, but it is substantially easier if they make sure they know who their clients are and understand the transactions that they carry out, and then look carefully for unusual or anomalous activity.
Now, Graham, isn't that exactly what we expect the banks to do in order to guard against money laundering?
Well, yes, it is, which means if you think about it, that a bank with weak or ineffective money laundering controls is as likely as not to have ineffective sanctions controls as well.
So this hint in the B&H report means that on top of the 200 billion euros of money laundering, we might also have to worry about breaches of international sanctions as well?
I think so, yeah, and that's an area, as far as I know, no one is currently looking at.
Wow. Okay, so back to B&H. Graham, I'm conscious that this section we've been looking at all week covers 2008 to 2013, and so far today we've only got to 2010.
But is there much more to cover after that?
Oh, yes.
Then I think we're going to have to continue with this discussion next week, Ray, as we've run out of time.
Okay, so let's summarise what we've seen so far. We've only looked at a 2-year period, but we've seen clear indications of criminal behaviour, both money laundering and now sanctions evasion, that was called out by external parties and which the bank ought to have taken as a prompt to take action or at least investigate further.
And next time, we'll find even more of them.
I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Dark Money Files. We hope you enjoyed it. If you would like to listen to future episodes, please subscribe through iTunes, Spotify, or your normal podcast provider. Thanks.